Morning. Welcome back to this session on literary theory. Today we'll be discussing the period of romantic writing in English literature. The painting that you just saw now is titled The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. The artist was called Caspar Friedrich, a German artist, and he painted this in the year 1880. This painting, I think, epitomizes what romantic writing stood for. You see in the painting, there is a man looking out at the sea, and it suggests the infinite possibilities of man and the mysterious splendor of nature. He has climbed high, he has seen much, but the infinite vista is still stretched before him. So this can be taken as the spirit that embodied Romanticism. Romanticism that swept over Europe, and Romanticism that created a crisis in the psyche of Europe. Now let's take a look at what exactly we mean by the term romantic. Initially, the word romantic, we could say, was derived from the word Rome. The topography of Rome was extensive, and the languages which originated from Latin was the official language, were Italian, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. And these languages together were called Romance languages. Later, literature written in these languages came to be defined or called as Romantic writings. The meaning then was further narrowed down to specific modes of writing. You could say that writings which foregrounded, or writings which were talking about chivalry, writings which had magic in them, and writings which spoke of courtly love were all considered to be romantic writing. In the next coming 17th and 18th century, you have a further shift of meaning in the notion of romantic literature. Romantic literature, it was defined, was based on the imagination, and it actually became a pejorative term because it was pitted against the rigid conventions of neoclassicism. Romantic writing became a negative space, a space that existed beyond the well-defined contours of neoclassicism. It is beyond the boundaries of rationalism, enlightenment. So these were the watchwords of neoclassicism, and any type of writing that did not follow the rigid rules set forward by the neoclassics came to be classified as romantic. And it was not used in a positive sense. It was used in a very negative manner to talk about, the lack of rules, the lack of conventions. It is all haphazard, a lot of imagination running in, and you're not very happy with the type of writing that came in, and that type of writing was labeled romantic. But slowly the tide began to turn. We all know of the French Revolution, and the French Revolution sort of created a huge difference in the minds of the people. And the rules and laws that were so dear to the neoclassics turned into something which was very negative, something which was repressive, something that was controlling and not allowing the artist to exercise his freedom. Romantics were therefore seen as positive because they were thirsty for transformation. They were very egalitarian in their approach. And the watchwords of French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, were highlighted, and any sort of writing that broke away from the rules became romantic writing. And the romantic writers were greatly influenced by the French Revolution, and that is why the great prophet of the Romantics, Wordsworth, said, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was the very heaven. Rousseau, when we talk about romantics, we have to mention Rousseau. He was a great influence on the Romantics, and he put forward the notion of the noble savage. So the noble savage becomes a recurring idea in romantic writings. And when we talk about romantic literature, we mostly focus on poetry. So because the session is rather short, we will only be talking about the 6 big writers, the great 6. You have Wordsworth, you have Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and of course you have Blake, the pre-romantic, the forerunner of the Romantics. So the Romantics there are certain common denominators you could find out, and all of them preferred to go back into the lap of nature rather than inhabit urban spaces. So that is one of the earlier stages of Romanticism, where you find this love for nature, surging forth. And Blake, this percuser, the pre-romantic poetry of Blake, the songs of innocence and experience, it was actually foregrounding the marginalized. He spoke of the little boy who had no money, he spoke of the chimney sweep. So all these people who were hitherto ignored in literature came to be focused on, came to be foregrounded. Now, the theory of Romanticism, or the idea of what romantic writing is, was put forward in the lyrical ballads. I'm sure all of you know about the lyrical ballads. And Wordsworth, in the preface, wrote that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, and it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Now, later ages have found a lot of problems with this particular formula put forward by Wordsworth. We will go into that in the later session, but now let's focus on what Wordsworth said. He is focusing on spontaneity. So art, if you remember, we spoke about the neoclassic artist who said that art is something that can be perfected. You can learn to be an artist, and the more you work on it, the better you become. Here you have a new notion of the artist coming up, the romantic artist, where the focus is on something which is spontaneous, something which is original. And we'll come back to the romantic artist a little while later. Now let's talk about the form of writing that the Romantics wanted. So we have the spontaneous overflow of emotion. Then when you come to Coleridge, he had a problem with the type of language Wordsworth advocated. He said that, poetry and prose are, there is an organic difference between the writing, and Coleridge actually speaks about the difference between fancy and imagination. So the romantic writer is a creative genius, and fancy and imagination again divided into primary imagination, secondary imagination. Let us take a quick look at what he means by fancy. So fancy has no counters to play with, he says. It deals with fixities and things which are definite. So you can think of memory as an example. You have an image of something which happened earlier. You see something now which reminds you of it. So these are two images, but both the images retain their original quality, right? So that is the basic level. It is something which everyone possesses. Then next he moves the differentiation between fancy and imagination. And imagination he divides into primary imagination and secondary imagination. So let us first take a look at primary imagination. It is necessary imagination, and it talks about the impression received through the senses. And it is common. Everybody has what Coleridge termed the primary imagination, and it is common to everyone. The secondary imagination is something superior. It is associated with creative genius. It is the exercise of free and deliberate will. So secondary imagination, let me point out, is what differentiates the creative genius, the artist, from the rest of the human beings. So here we come across the birth of the artist, who is treated as special, who's treated as different from the rest of the, you could call them the hoi polloi. There are many reasons why the Romantics chose to privilege the artist in this manner. We will come to that. So let us first talk about who or what the Romantics thought described or defined the artist. So the poet, they said, is a man speaking to men, but he has more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm, greater knowledge of human nature, and comprehensive vision. So these are the marking characteristics of a poet. So you cannot say that the poet is like an ordinary man. He is somewhat different. I think Rousseau put it rather clearly. He says, I am not made like anyone I've seen. If not superior, at least I'm different. So this difference is what is focused on. This difference is what is highlighted upon by the Romantics as far as their definition of the poet or the creative genius is considered. Right? We will go into the socio-political reasons behind this in a little while from now. But now I would like to go back to, again, a poem which I think epitomizes the romantic spirit, which is Coleridge's Kubla Khan. So Kubla Khan, actually, the title says Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. This is the title, Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. And the story behind the writing of Kubla Khan is as popular as the poem itself. And Coleridge himself tells us that he was reading Percass's Pilgrimage. He fell asleep and he dreamt of writing an epic poem which was perhaps around 300 lines. He woke up, he started writing spontaneously, and suddenly somebody disturbed him. He was interrupted, somebody rang the bell. He had to get up and go and, leave the poem midway. And he couldn't complete the poem. And we have the poem in the form that is which he said is incomplete. So this is a story which specifies the unique position of the creative genius, a man who is inspired, a man who is on a journey of spontaneous emotion, something which he can't recapture. It is transient, that emotion is transient. He was unable to recapture it after that, and the poem was left a fragment. How tragic is that? Later critics, particularly Timothy Batty, has come up with this idea. He says that, no, this poem is not a fragment at all. There is a clear cohesion between the introduction and the coming stanzas. So what do you mean by calling it a fragment? So we then come to understand that this is one way of telling you that this poem can only be written by this specific writer. Nobody else can do that. So you're privileging the artist, you're privileging the creative genius that goes into the writing of this poem. So you notice that as much as the poem is important, the story that went into the origin of the poem is also important. If you look at the poem, I'm not going into the poem as such, but people who are familiar with the poem know that it is about Kubla Khan and his pleasure palace. Now, I was talking about fancy and imagination, and I would like to give you an example about primary and secondary imagination based on this poem. The river Alf, it is said, the river Alf is a symbol of the unconscious. The river Alf can also be taken as primary imagination. So Alf is the first letter of the Greek alphabet alpha. So you begin with that, the unconscious, which is a seat of all your imagination, your desire, and your dreams. And this flows till it emerges as a fountain. And the fountain which mixes what is outside as well what is inside, thereby becoming the secondary imagination and the source of all poetry. Then the later poets you have are Keats and Shelley. Of course, Byron is there. Now we just talk about Keats and Shelley. I think Keats and Shelley always think about their early deaths and how, they sort of, at the height of their creative genius, they were cut away from life, cut off from life. It is always a good practice to read Keats's Ode to Autumn side by side with Shelley's West Wind to know the different trajectories of the romantic mind, which again are not very different as, not really different, quite similar rather. Ode to Autumn is about the season, and it talks about the process of life, birth, death, and perhaps the hope of regeneration. West Wind in Shelley, the wind is a spirit of rejuvenation. So we find that the seasons are greatly important to the romantic writers, and autumn especially doesn't just talk of death and decay. Autumn holds the promise of rebirth. Autumn holds the promise of life to come. Again, there are two other poems which we can again read side by side. Keats' Nightingale and Skylark by Shelley. So Nightingale is a bird of darkness, whereas Skylark is clearly visible. And in the poem Nightingale, Ode to the Nightingale, joy and sorrow are inextricably linked, whereas Shelley's Skylark is unimpeded joy. One difference you must highlight between Keats and Shelley is that for Shelley, his poems become a vehicle to disseminate his political ideas. He says, lift me as a leaf. And in West Wind he says, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Again, do notice how the romantic writer is all foregrounded in his poetry. Like the celebrated writer Walt Whitman said, I celebrate myself. So the poems are ultimately foregrounding not just nature, not just marginalized people like the idiot boy. They're always talking about the process of creation and the unique position that the creative writer enjoys. So, let us now sum up the basic tenets of Romanticism. Again, like I said, it all has I in it. Imagination, intuition, idealism, inspiration, and individuality. So you have imagination, which we have already talked about, the concepts put forward by Coleridge, fancy, primary imagination, secondary imagination, and imagination, like I initially told you, was privileged over reason. This was a backlash. The neoclassics privileged reason, the romantics privileged imagination. And yes, the next point is intuition. Intuition was feeling and instincts, the gut feeling that you have, the sixth sense they talk about, and this is given more importance than reason. You remember that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. The next is individuality. Now, we've already spoken of individuality, how Rousseau privileged the artist, how the romantics celebrated the individual, and like I said, Walt Whitman, a romantic writer from America, wrote a poem titled A Song of Myself. It begins, I celebrate myself. Now, why did they desire individuality? That is a question that we need to find an answer to. Why was there such a great emphasis on the creative writer? Now, we must also look at the socio-political surroundings in England at that point of time, in Europe rather, and we understand that industrialization had begun and the advent of mass production was spreading through Europe. And an unoriginal poem was compared to the unthinking production of the machine. So what have you to say differently was the major question that the romantics had to face. And the next problem, the contextual influence of this, was the sense of identity crisis, where the human soul must struggle for relevance in a society that is filled with machines. So this is what they fear, whether we'll be part of the machine, whether we will lose our individuality. Therefore, the intellectual, spiritual faculties need to be heightened. Yes. A third reason was the awareness of a growing mass culture, like Walter Jackson Bate terms, the burden of the past. As time passes, this one question becomes increasingly difficult to answer. What is left to do? Everything has been done already. So the romantics were very concerned with the impossibility of avoiding repetition and imitation. So they did not want to echo any poet. They did not want to sort of continue a tradition. They wanted to be different. And they were obsessed with this idea of not repeating more than any preceding literary tradition. So that is the great reason. There's a reason for this huge emphasis on individuality. And then you have idealism. Idealism is the mind forces the world we perceive to take the shape of space and time. So idealism refers to any theory that emphasizes the spirit, the mind, or language over matter. So these are the reasons why the romantics wrote in this particular manner. Now, Raymond Williams has encapsulated the concept of the romantic artist in a very clear form. And he says, there was a major change in the relationship between the writer and the reader. And one reason for this change was the rise of the middle class. So you have the writer who has lost royal patronage and he is thrown into the literary market. There's no patronage anymore. He has to survive in a very, very commercialized space. The production of art then was coming to be considered as a specialized kind of production. This followed from the institutionalization of commercial production. So, thereby, you have to separate art from the other types of commercial production and the theory of the superior reality of art. The idea of the independent creative writer comes into being. So now I hope we have sort of briefly spoken about Romanticism. I hope I've been able to throw some light on the basic ideas of Romantic writing, the major content, what they were talking about, like the Byronic hero who sort of defies all conventions. And the poetry, I think poetry becomes one of the marks of Romantic writing, and the big six, we've already spoken about them, and the theory of Romantic writing, and the reasons why they were privileging imagination and individuality over reason and logic. The main reason, the main idea was that they were struggling to survive in a different world, a world which the French Revolution had irrevocably changed. And for once, rules were not important, ideas were more important. Newer and newer ideas, this yearning after novelty becomes the hallmark of Romanticism. Thank you.